Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. On this episode, I talked to Tim Marshall, journalist, broadcaster, and author of the best-selling Prisoners of Geography, as well as several sequels, including The Future of Geography, which delves into the geostrategic competition in space. This topic was the focus of our discussion, as Tim and I talked about how international politics, particularly the rivalry between the US and China, is playing out in space and what it means for us here on Earth. So, Tim, it's great to have you on. Welcome to the podcast.
Greetings, thank you.
Tim, am I right in thinking that just before the end of 2023, I was looking at the top 10 bestsellers in the UK, I think it was paperbacks, and you had 3 in the top 10, is that right?
I couldn't possibly comment, but yes.
From
memory, it was first, 4th, and 10th.
Impressive that you can do that from memory. Yeah. That's incredible. That's testament to the popularity of the books that you've written, and actually, I think also people's interest in understanding what's going on around us in the world today, and that's really what your books I think have been key to doing. And I really wanted to sort of dive into talking about the most recent book, so The Future of Geography, and really focusing on what you've written about space. But maybe for those who aren't familiar, it would be great to get an understanding from you of what prompted you and drove you to write that series of books in the first place, and maybe give us a quick overview of them.
I wasn't driven, and thank you for your kind comments, I wasn't driven to write a series. I just wrote a book, and it was Prisoners of Geography. And the basic premise is that if you want to understand international relations, one of the things you need to understand is geography, and that if you haven't got an understanding of the geography of the situation, it's hard to understand the rest. So I took that premise, that mountains, rivers, deserts, etc. are very important in various ways, and wrote a book, Prisoners of Geography, about how, to an extent, we are. Leaders and countries are prisoners of their geography, but prisoners not in the sense that there's nothing they can't do, but in the sense that what they do is so often connected to their geography. And I just think I hit lucky. Now, my ego is not so small that I wouldn't venture that I'm able to hopefully put across sometimes what people think are of complex ideas in hopefully a quite clear way. And that talent, such as it is, came out at a time when we were in a really, and I think remains so, in a really confusing, difficult period of history to understand. Because we knew the bipolar world of the USSR and America, the Cold War, but it's much harder to get your head around the multipolar world where there's so many different actors free to act in a way they wish, out with the discipline of the Cold War. New technology, you name it, 9/11 comes into play. There's just all this stuff swirling around. So I just think the two things put together, I hit lucky on the timing, and a couple of people bought it.
Yeah, I've probably lost count of the number of times I've recommended Prisoners of Geography and the subsequent books to people. They really are excellent and great for getting up to speed.
Oh, right, sorry, I didn't. Forgive me. You asked about the series. Yeah, then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course.
The publishers said, "Look, this is great. Can you do a follow-up?" And I thought, well, which bits? Sorry, the first one was, the big players like Russia, China, USA, India, and there's a chapter on the Middle East, chapter on Europe, chapter on Africa, Latin America. So for the second one, The Power of Geography, I went a bit more focused, like a chapter just on Greece. a chapter just on Iran, a chapter just on the Sahel region of Africa, a chapter just on the UK, etc. And then for the third, where to go? And I've always been interested in space, and I realised the blindingly obvious that international relations, which is what I write about, is played out in space. Therefore, and so Future of Geography came out.
Yeah, what was really interesting for me about that was that your last chapter of The Power of Geography was about space.
Yeah.
So what drove you to sort of take that and turn that into an entire book? And was it just that there's so much more to write about?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Doing the last chapter of Power of Geography on space, I very, very quickly realised there's a book in this. Now, sometimes you get an idea and you think about it and you think, well, maybe there's a magazine article out of that. Or you think, that's just not worth bothering with. And sometimes you think, there's a whole book in that. And I just looked at just the breadth of it. And also I ventured out a little bit from my usual safety zone of international relations and went back all the way to the beginnings of our interest in the cosmos. I'm going back 20, 30,000 years and cave drawings just to sort of set the scene, and then went through the sometimes ponderous but sometimes accelerating use of technology in our understanding of space, and then rocket, pun intended, all the way up into the 20th century. But the core of the book remains international relations and the impact that space has on it and vice versa. But no, you were right. It was that chapter. I just thought there is so much going on that it's easily book length stuff.
Yeah, and it's incredible, actually. I think probably what's happening now, and in terms of developments in geopolitics, but also in technology in the fields that enable us to, I say us, the human race, to go into space and be active outside of the Earth's atmosphere.
I was really taken in the research by a whole bunch of stuff, but one of them was just this relationship that we have. I mean, this is the sort of non-technical side of it, the sense of awe and wonder and all the rest of it. But then when I started getting into what the Greeks learned and taught us, and how the great centuries of Arabic learning built on it, and our understanding through technology, through maths, and then through telescopes and whatever you have to help us understand, and then our relationship with this. With the cosmos, which changes over the time through science, from it being entirely about gods and being up there and doing things, into an understanding of how and things are, not necessarily why things are, but how things are, and our place in it. It's a revolutionary, literally, moment when we finally accept. As a species, that actually the sun doesn't go around us. That's a serious change in our heads, that we are the centre of the universe, everything goes round us, which of course has a knock-on a religious connotation. And then to reverse that and think, oh, we're not the centre of everything, and in fact we go round our star. I was just fascinated by that changing relationship before I then got on to, Apollo 11 and then laser-guided missiles.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how a lot of that history and the mythology in particular is reflected still in our relationship with space. You see it in the names of, spacecraft, space programs, etc., whether it's in the US or China.
Throughout this, the how it represents the nation or the groupings of nations, because Apollo obviously goes all the way back to the Greeks, but so does the modern iteration, which is the Artemis project, which is when the Americans are going to land on the moon in 2 years' time, and man and a woman. Because Artemis is also from the Greek. But the Chinese are busy naming all their rockets and spaceships after either things that relate to their immediate history, like the Long March of Mao in the 40s, or they go all the way back to some of their ancient, and they really are ancient, that culture, legends about moon goddesses and things. So, we carry the ancient and the modern with us into space.
Yeah, and it's what's fascinating is seeing how that it plays out right now. You talked about that stability maybe that we had in the Cold War era, where it was that bipolar world, and we've now moved into this sort of really confusing world over the last 2 or more decades, and that's being reflected. The current geopolitics, let's face it, is very messy, but we're seeing that reflected in astropolitics. And how worried should we be that the current state of of international relations is going to shape how we proceed over the next 10, 20 years as nations move to do more in space?
Yeah, what's going on in space, in what I call Space Race 2.0, does reflect what's going on down here. Story of the last few decades is that after the end of the Cold War, which the Americans won, the Russians and Chinese, Russia has regenerated itself, and China has really accelerated into becoming a world power. And both of those great nations are not prepared to accept the post-Second World War order and all the institutions. These are the Bretton Woods institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, and in the wider sense, things like NATO and the EU, and even the UN to an extent. They're just not prepared to accept that this is the dominant rules of how we manage events globally. And they set out to undermine it. And they've done it very successfully through things like the Asian Investment Bank and many other things. And the Americans, of course, took their eye completely off the ball by spending 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Russians and Chinese thought, this is great. All that bandwidth concentrated on those two areas, we'll go and play in the rest of the world. So that's a sort of big backdrop. When it comes to space, it's replicated insofar as the American-led industrialized democracies, because the West, there is such a thing as the West still, but I prefer often in international relations to talk about the industrialized advanced democracies, because then you are including people like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and India. They are going up into space when it comes to things like the Artemis Accords as a bloc. It's an American-led bloc. The Chinese, which is now America's biggest rival in space, is going up with a much smaller bloc, which basically consists of Russia and occasionally Iran hanging onto their coattails. But that also reflects what's going on here. There is an American-led advanced industrialized bloc, G20 vaguely type of countries, or certainly G7. And then there is the Chinese-led bloc, Russia junior partner, Iran, North Korea, and one or two other people that will follow them, such as Nicaragua and Eritrea. So it's replicated in space, which I find really interesting. And that will be that is the two blocs that will go up to try to dominate the moon through the rest of this decade. And both say they want a moon base by the early 2030s, which means the mid-2030s probably. And hopefully, after that period of competition and Klondike gold rush, they could actually realise that, we really ought to go up as one species and not as nations, but that's a work in progress as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain worrying aspects of the whole topic that you cover in the book in terms of that competition for advantage in space. And I think what people might not realise until, if they haven't read it or they're not familiar with the subject, is there are certain regions, there are certain locations and places in space where there is a certain advantage to be had by getting there first, being able to control that area to the extent that it can be controlled. And that is kind of there's a lot to worry about in the book in terms of that aspect of how that competition might play out and what it might mean for conflict on Earth.
Well, I'm fairly sanguine about worrying, but only insofar as, you can never really write about international relations in any given period without worrying, because
True.
Competition appears to be built in up to a point, as well as cooperation. But yes, thanks for teasing out the geographic aspect of it, because this is where I do think it fits into the trilogy. Because there is a geography to space, and there are bits of it you're more interested in than others. And a few examples is low Earth orbit, because the majority of the satellites are there. And although it's a very big area, there are 8,000 satellites now. There will be well over 20,000 by the end of the decade, and possibly, heading up to 50, 60,000.
Yeah, it's getting increasingly congested and not easy to navigate, or getting harder to navigate, I suppose, in terms of not just putting things into low Earth orbit, but then getting past that area.
Exactly. Congested, debris, which is very dangerous to everybody. And of course, the satellites are now crucial to the world economies. I regard them as part of a country's critical infrastructure. So go a bit further up into geosynchronous orbit. This is where if you position a satellite there, it will revolve around the Earth at the same speed that the Earth is moving, and consequently the satellite is above the same piece of territory all the time. Now, the area up there, of course, is even greater than the area of near-Earth satellite orbits. So you'd think there's a lot more space to put satellites, but there aren't, because at that height, because that's how we can understand things, you need a lot greater bandwidth to direct your satellite signal down back to Earth. And if you position one satellite too close to another satellite, and they're both beaming out the signals, and they're too close to each other, then they interfere. So there's only so many positions around the Earth. So again, that is first come, first served. Then you get all the way up to the moon, and the Americans famously landed in the Sea of Tranquility. Not a great deal there, very flat ground. It's why they chose it. The action, though, is at the south pole of the moon, because that's where most of the water is. And if there is water, you can theoretically sustain life, have a base, extract hydrogen from it to fuel your base, and then start mining, because there are all sorts of precious metals up there, which the economic modelling is far from certain. But if you discover a oil field somewhere in 1900, you're going to take a very close look at it, because you realise that the future is in oil. Well, part of the future is in these precious metals. So you cannot afford, as an advanced power, not to go and speculate up there on the moon, which is why everybody is going to. But, the South Pole, the surface of the moon is about the same size as the surface of Africa, so it's pretty big. But if you're only going to one part of it, the South Pole, and everyone's going there, it could get crowded. So the best thing to do would be everybody agree with each other what they can and can't do.
Which there aren't really any. There are international agreements, but nobody's really taking them seriously. Is that fair to say at the moment?
I think that's fair, sadly, because there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But one is that how do you enforce them anyway? But secondly, they're out of date. Including the militarization of space, which the treaties of the 60s talk about no weapons of mass destruction, which means basically nukes. Fair enough. But there were no lasers then. There are lasers now. So you could already put a laser, a direct energy weapon, on a satellite. As far as we know, no one's done it. If one country does do it, every country will do it. And when it comes to the moon, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does say that no one country can have sovereignty. Fine. I won't have sovereignty. I'll just get there first and plant my flag and spread out a bit and say it really isn't a good idea you being anywhere near us on safety grounds, which brings me back to the Artemis Accords, led by America, signed by 30 countries. They all agree, if you've put the effort in, and I have some sympathy with this, if you've put all the years of research, all the billions of dollars, and you've gone there and you've got there, and you've found your seam of lithium or whatever it is you're after, you can declare a safety zone around it because it would be dangerous for other people to start moving in there. But the problem with that is that, yes, you haven't declared sovereignty over it, but you've declared a safety zone. And if you're not a member of Artemis, well, you and whose army says I can't land? So, it's a new field which we need to navigate.
Yeah, it's really. It will be fascinating to see how this plays out, but then not just for how it goes in terms of the resource competition on the moon, or that you write in the book also about some of the plans to extract minerals, etc., from asteroids and potentially use the moon as a base from which to further explore space. And you talk about Mars, and there's obviously plans to send spacecraft to Mars. So it's much more than just about mining the moon, isn't it? There's a lot more going on up there.
There's two schools of thought. If you are of the school of thought in the first place that thinks we should be going out there, I mean, there are people who think it's a waste of money. If you're in the other camp, there's two schools of thought. One, bypass the moon, go straight to Mars. What's the point of wasting any time? The second school of thought is the moon is where we will A, learn lessons and iron out faults, and B, it makes sense as a launching pad because the amount of fuel it takes to get from the Earth to the moon is many, many, many times more than the amount of fuel you need to get from the moon to Mars, even though Mars is, millions of miles further away. And that's because the lack of atmosphere on the moon. So you need, not much liftoff. I hesitate to say you just sort of flick your rocket with a finger and off it goes, but compared to the swimming pool worth of Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of fuel you need to get out of the Earth's atmosphere, it's more or less like that. So the second school of thought says that, and that is the one that at the moment, and probably for the foreseeable future, has won the argument, which is why this is the idea of having moon bases. It is to mine, it is to learn lessons, and it is to eventually use those bases to start launching for Mars. And in the meantime, we will be sending probes to Mars, which we've already sent, and sending them back. But again, it would be theoretically cheaper and easier to do all this from the moon once you have established your presence on the moon. Now, it sounds a bit sci-fi, and yet it's really not that far away, because at the moment the signs, certainly when it comes to China, I think they've made their decision and they're going to stick to it. It's a little bit different when it comes to the United States and some of the other countries because, budgetary constraints kick in and you want to get re-elected and you need your budget to do X, Y, and Z. And so space exploration is one of the fairly easy cuts you could make. The Chinese have made the decision on strategic grounds. They are looking to the future and they intend to own it. The Americans, next year, it looks as if there will be a crewed mission and it will go around the back of the moon further out than any human has ever gone and slingshot back round. And this is to test the kit. If it goes well, 2026, because it's slipped by a year, you will see a man and a woman landing on the moon and walking, which I think will generate another generation of fascination with space, the way that, I was only 10 in '69 for the moon landings, but even as a 10-year-old, I was quite gripped by it, and I think people a few years older were gripped. It was one of the biggest television audiences ever. And I think, despite having been there, I think in the modern age, to see a man and a woman, probably in HD and probably in colour this time, I think that could regenerate another era of fascination with this.
It does sound. It sounds phenomenal and incredible because it's not since 1972? Was it? Am I right in thinking that was the last time?
Yeah. And I should know this off by heart, but ballpark 72, 73.
Yeah, around then. Yeah, and then it sort of tailed off, didn't it? In terms of public interest.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the. It's kind of sad, but it was Mr. Gene Cernan. He was the last guy up, and on, and then off, and they came up. The last one came up docked. Sorry, the last Apollo mission that landed on the moon. Then they blasted off, docked with the docking station to get them back home. And when they docked, that was the time they were going to have a press conference. And no one took it. None of the networks bothered, the American networks, because the audience just wasn't there anymore. I mean, this was an amazing thing, but nobody tuned in. And Nixon had seen this, President Nixon, a few years before, because he was the one who really pulled the plug. I mean, in shorthand, what he said was, you keep going up there and bringing back some rocks. We've got enough rocks. I'm not paying for this anymore. And that was the end. And some people ask, how come is it that we've not been back for more than 50 years? And the answer is mostly commercial and strategic and military. Well, strategic and military are handmaidens. What was the rationale of going back? We'd got the rocks. What's the point of keep going back and doing that? Whereas fast forward to now, and there is theoretically a commercial imperative to go and get the precious metals. There is the scientific imperative. There is the new bragging rights. They're nowhere near what they were in the 60s. I mean, I believe that one of the major reasons for space race was to prove which political system was the better. And in fact, Kennedy is pretty much on record as saying that. They had to. There's a speech he gave. So I'm jumping around here. I'll try and link it back to now. Kennedy gave a speech, not his famous, "We go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." That's the famous one. But prior to that, he'd made a speech in which he said, mankind, because he used that language in those days, he meant humankind, of course, is at a crossroads in history where it has a choice to make. And basically what he was saying, does it go down the route of Soviet communism, or does it go down the route of democratic capitalism? And he pretty much pinned getting to the moon on persuading people to make the choice of democratic capitalism. Pretty much spelt it out. And I think that was, possibly the overarching driving force. There was lots of knock-on effects, but that was it. And that went away as well. So those bragging rights are back, but I don't think they're anywhere near as strong. So now the real rationale is that it is imperative to be a space power. That's why there's so many space forces in the military now. It's pretty important to make sure that if this is the new oil that's on the moon, the metals, you don't miss out. And then scientifically, we want to be the ones that do this and move on to Mars. So, the rationale is now back to be there.
And you mentioned that maybe that ideological competition isn't as strong now. But is there still likely to be a knock-on effect if the US and its allies are able to achieve firsts in space, whether it's establishing a base on the moon, etc., ahead of China and its allies, that will potentially reinforce democracy or weaken it?
It would reinforce it, but also, conversely, if China builds the first base, and they've said they'll lay the first brick in 2028 with some 3D printing. Now, if they do, it would be remote 3D printing. If they do, it would only be symbolic anyway. It's just not going to happen this decade. But that would, of course, be part of their rationale and their narrative. I mean, President Xi leads this narrative that the West is in terminal decline and that China is going to be, the global force of the 21st century. And this would be part of that. Only, to be honest with you, a relatively small part. But the Chinese have completely bought into the strategic side of this, that that space is part of being a global power. And I wouldn't get too sidetracked with the moon because it's far from all about that, but that is a part of it. I think the satellites are as big a part as that is, and who has the best ones for both spying and commercial and other things. And the space station, I mean, they are very proud that when the International Space Station is taken apart in 2028, they will be the only ones with a space station up there. And it'll be a national space station while the Artemis countries start building another one. So, yes, the short answer is you're right. There is still a degree of bragging rights in it. But I think the harder things, such as the military aspect, communications aspect, spying aspect, I think that's more of a driving force.
Yeah, and I guess there's two aspects to that. There is the getting the positions, the more strategic, the better positions for your satellites, but also the better technology in your satellites. And that competition is reflected on Earth in terms of not just satellites for civilian purposes, but satellites for military purposes as well. And I suppose the difference being perhaps that in China there's more of a state directive behind it, whereas in the US it's more of a mix of private, public.
Yeah.
And we've seen, it's probably this is probably a good moment to touch on the role of some of these big companies that we've seen grow up in terms of space exploration, SpaceX, others who are leading the way in terms of trying to develop that technology and bring costs down, but bringing another element of complexity, I suppose, to the situation.
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on there. But you reminded me, I omitted when we were talking earlier about proving yourself via your space exploits. I should have mentioned India and last year's incredible feat of landing at uncrewed, landing at the South Pole, because it's incredibly difficult to land at the South Pole. No one's ever done it before with a soft landing, because it's strewn with boulders, ravines, craters, and mountains. It's incredibly hard to get your trajectory in and land, and they did it. And it was a fantastic coming out party for them, because a lot of the eyes of the political world were on India, and then they say, "Oh, by the way, we've just landed at the South Pole of the moon." So, first country ever to do that. Sorry. So to come on to your next point. You're right to identify one of the major differences this time, Space Race 2.0, is the role of commercial companies. Now, they were always there. Boeing and whoever, Lockheed Martin, were involved in the Apollo mission. But the difference this time is that the commercial companies are front and center. And I think it's SpaceX, Elon Musk's SpaceX, that's building the lander, for example, for the Artemis moon mission to land on the moon. And Bezos's guys are involved in something else as well. And the Italian commercial company is going to build part of the robotic arm for the docking station. Commercial companies are absolutely front and center. And it's a big commercial government drive. China also has a lot of space startup companies and some pretty big space companies now. Nothing as close as America, but there will be. There'll be a Chinese company, and I wish I knew its name. You could invest in it. That will be as big as Lockheed Martin and Boeing and SpaceX. But the difference between the two systems is that the Chinese system, yes, there are private companies, but they are not free to act as they choose. All companies are in some way connected to the Chinese Communist Party and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, basically, SpaceX could turn round to NASA and Washington and say, "Nah, you're all right. Don't want to do this." That doesn't happen in the Chinese system. You don't say no to the Chinese Communist Party. And there is this absolute understanding of the fusion of military strategy and commerce under the Chinese system. So, although commerce is a part of it on that side of the equation as well, it's in a slightly different manner than it is in the United States.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's going to be a key part, I think, for people to watch and keep track of and see, okay, what are those companies doing and what sort of technology are they developing, either in cooperation with partners or in competition with each other.
Yeah, they're doing brilliant stuff, the Chinese. They are, and they're churning out more PhDs in the sort of sciences that are related to the space industry. They're now beginning to churn out more patents for things that they're inventing. I mean, the intellectual property giant remains the United States, but it's something, that's another area of superiority that the Chinese are seriously beginning to challenge now.
Yeah, and it's an area I think that the US has increasingly identified that it needs to defend itself in terms of competition and seeing that threat
Yeah, it's a
of
related issue. I
IP
mean,
theft
it's
and
not
things like
really.
that. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No. Yeah, carry on.
The super semiconductor chips. You know, the Americans asked the Dutch, because the Dutch are one of the world's leaders in making the really hardcore stuff.
Yeah.
Please don't give any of your intellectual property, or even sell, or even hint at it to China, because the Americans are probably a decade ahead on super semiconductors. Or well, the Dutch are, and the Taiwanese are, and this is part of the core element of space exploration, but also AI and quantum and all the rest of it. And the Americans do have an edge on this and can buy in the expertise from friendly countries. But China, of course, has to react to that, and it's not just going to give up. It will attempt to match the computing power and find a way of building their own. But at the moment, that intellectual property remains out of their sight. But I don't see why they won't catch up as the years roll by.
Yeah, and I think that's in line with probably the competition on Earth, let alone once we talk about space. But yeah, and it's what's interesting, I suppose, also is that we've spent a lot of time in this discussion focused on China and the US. And one thing that struck me was you had a chapter in your book about Russia, and it really was that Russia seems to be falling away in space capability. And it's something that maybe is related to the situation in Ukraine. I mean, there's a long-term aspect to it, but also the short-term aspect of going into Ukraine has probably damaged their space program, as well as many other aspects of Russian political and economic life, I would suggest.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff there, including the military aspect of the space military aspect of the Ukraine war. In the first point, though, is you're right about falling away, but it's important to make the distinction. I think because of budgetary constraints on the Russian space program, and because of the Ukraine war and the international situation, the amount of money going towards the civilian side in Roscosmos and other elements is dwindling, and I think that they will probably they are putting more and more of their budget into trying to maintain parity when it comes to space, satellites, weaponry, getting to the moon, etc., and less on the civilian side. So I do think they are falling away as a civilian space exploration power, but they absolutely intend to maintain parity with the Americans, for example, in anti-satellite weapons. So that's where a lot of it will go. And it's interesting, this is where something fairly new happened in 2022, and well, it happens every day. But in the first few days of the invasion in 2022, a lot of the Ukrainian internet was knocked out, especially in the Irpin region. And it was Musk that flew in his satellite dishes for his Starlink internet service. And he did it for civilian purposes, to get the civilians back on, up and running. But of course, the Ukrainian military jumped on it and utilized it for military purposes, at which point, of course, the Russians started firing laser beams at the Musk's satellite system, and they've been playing cat and mouse ever since. So again, for people that don't follow this stuff, you can now have the direct energy. They are transportable on the back of a big truck, stick it up, aim it at the satellite, beam energy at it, and you can dazzle it. And if you're dazzling it, it can't be sending its signal down. You can send spoof packages of information up, which confuse its chips, etc., etc. And this has been going on for the past, 2 years now. And the Starlink they take various measures and move the satellites around, and the Russians track them and keep firing at them. But what really struck me about this was that this is a new aspect of warfare, and any modern country now has to have the ability to dazzle your opponent's satellites in extremis, and of course the ability to try and protect your satellites from being dazzled. Then you move on a couple of notches from that. Several countries, four countries have fired ballistic missiles from Earth, from land-based, and they've hit their own satellites to test whether they could blow satellites in space up from a missile fired from Earth. India, China, the USA, and Russia have all done this. So again, that capability is now there, that in the event of a major war, it's probable some countries will try to blow satellites out of space. The last aspect is the potential for putting these lasers on the satellites. The Americans have now got a system where you can fire an energy beam at a drone. I think the maximum distance they've got is just a few kilometers. So you see a drone coming towards you, let's say for example, in the Red Sea near Yemen. And instead of firing a $2 million missile at it, you fire $1 worth of electricity at it, frazzle its chips, and it goes down. No one, to my knowledge, has even suggested putting those on a satellite. But you got to think about it, because that's the history of warfare. So I think it'll be hard over the decades for people not to put that type of tech on their satellites for defensive purposes only.
Yeah, and what was fascinating in the book was that you actually took, you've given a great summary there, I think, of some really interesting aspects of current geopolitical and military technology situation that we're in. But then in the book, you sort of go through some fictional scenarios of what might occur in the future. And I thought that was a really interesting mechanism to use to try and describe some of the potential things. I mean, these are very, for anyone who hasn't read the book, very brief scenarios, but really interesting to go through and think through some of these issues. What happens if somebody attacks somebody else's satellites, or, if there's disagreement over, and all those agreements aren't in place about, okay, well, what do you do? What's legitimate in terms of retaliation, etc. And it's going to be an interesting couple of decades ahead of us.
I'll be honest with you, it was fun. I mean, it's not fun if it's real, a future war. But I just wanted to. What I was really doing was trying to point out that the way things have gone here, why would it be different up there? And so I concocted, and I just made them up off my head, that in, let's say the late 2030s, we've got this safety zone that's been declared, and we've got a base, we've got a landing strip, and sort of things that look like space shuttles are coming in and out. And one country decides, well, we're going to start mining this area as well, and you can't stop us. And they try to land, and they're dazzled. The pilots are dazzled as they come in, or jammed, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Let's say it's the Russians, just because it's easier to get your head around something, and it's the Brits that are dazzling them. And they have to pull up in a hurry. They then claim there was some damage to their craft. They hit a British satellite above the moon to make a point. Everyone gets very cross. People are starting to maneuver bits of kit here and there. And luckily, the UN office of the Space Office of the United Nations calls an emergency meeting of the Moon Council. I'm actually making even more stuff up now. But the point I'm trying to make is that that's the sort of thing that happens here. There is an incident, let's say in the South China Sea, where one boat rams another boat, and this does happen in the South China Sea, and usually it calms down after a couple of days. But what happens if it doesn't? Then suddenly you've got some kinetic action. Suddenly you've got to have a UN meeting. There's crisis meetings. You try and get around them. So I just put a couple of scenarios out, three I think it is, out there in the future, of the similar sort of activity, but just taking place in space, just to get us to start thinking that we better put the guardrails in place now, rather than wait until these incidents potentially begin to happen. And that's why, and this actually is probably the biggest thing for me coming out of the book, which I didn't realize going into the book, was the need to have new treaties, 21st century treaties for 21st century technology, and I just don't think they're there.
Yeah, and there were I think probably about 3 other aspects of those scenarios that I thought really
You'd have to remind me.
That really gave me food for thought. One was what you just mentioned there, obviously the aspect around the international agreements and deciding what to do and how to work together or not. But another one was the element of what it means for us on Earth. So in terms of how a lot of the technology for putting satellites up there and keeping them up there, it needs people on the ground to monitor them, steer them, maintain them, etc. And those points can be vulnerable to attack. And something happens in space, and all of a sudden somebody launches a ballistic missile at somebody else's ground station. So there was that sort of aspect. But then the third one was actually the role of China, which came through in those scenarios. And in one, I think you had a potential almost an outbreak of nuclear war, and China making the call to the US and Russia and saying, well, let's not do that.
I think that was the furthest out, some 2040s or something, where it's China that picks up the phone and tells Russia and America, calm down. But a long time before that, there is a scenario which I actually think is more complete guesswork and less sort of future sci-fi stuff, and that's in just a few years, and the Chinese have built up an amphibious force on its coast.
Yes.
And of course, everyone's starting, it could be the invasion of Taiwan, but they're very puzzled because it's only half the forces that you think would be required. Oh, we don't, this is weird. And the Chinese are just saying, oh, just military exercises, which, is what the Russians were saying before they went into Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then one morning they all leave, and then suddenly half the American satellites looking at that part of the world go down through a cyber attack, which no one can find out who did it. Everyone assumes this is it for Taiwan, and everyone starts preparing defences, this, that, and the other, da. And then 2 or 3 hours later, the satellites come back on, and all the ships have gone back, all the planes have gone back, but someone's on the phone and telling me that Kinmen Island, 20,000 paratroopers of just Chinese paratroopers have landed. This Kinmen Island is a Taiwan island, but it's only about 2 miles off the Chinese mainland. So it's 110 miles from Taiwan. And in my concocted scenario, well, it's too late to do anything.
Yeah.
And they've pulled it off, but they've managed to pull it off by a cyber attack on the satellites. So, I'm not saying this is even necessarily possible. It's just the sort of thing in modern warfare connected to space, which again is precisely why so many major countries now have space commands in their military, just to get us, thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the point where there's even a comedy series making fun of Space Force, etc. But yeah, I mean, it is that militarization, I suppose, of space that is probably most concerning. But it's inevitable in the sense that, as you said, what happens on Earth is going to be reflected.
Yeah,
in space.
I mean, we invent ships, and it's not too long before we invent military navies. We invent aeroplanes, and well, what do you think's going to happen? And we invent the ability to be in space. It's inevitable. Like I said, I'm sanguine about it. Doesn't mean I'm not, concerned, but it's just another iteration of our long learning curve about how to share things out equitably.
Yeah, I mean, and I remember there was a sort of, you ended the chapter you wrote in Power Geography, you ended it with a note of positivity in terms of emphasising that when astronauts have gone into space and looked back at the Earth, those sort of national boundaries tend to fall away. And I wonder if that may still yet have a significant psychological impact on
Have you seen Star Trek?
people that go up. Well,
it's great, isn't it? Federation
yeah.
of planets, and everyone's finally got together on Earth, and we're all us instead of being us and them. No, I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I always end up talking about lasers and UN Security Council meetings, but I should perhaps push more the positives. The satellites have revolutionized many things, including our understanding of climate change. And, we're in a better place if we at least understand what the problem is to then try and fix it. Because, for example, they can measure the temperatures of the oceans, which we can't do with a thermometer. Well, we can measure a tiny little bit of it, but not the way that the satellites can.
Yeah.
Some of the emerging economies in the world, which are trying to link themselves, I'm thinking particularly of the continent of Africa, where it's difficult to know exactly where to put your highway or your train track to link to country X. The satellites are helping you to know exactly where to put it at the least cost and the most efficiency to help link your economies to bring prosperity to people. The agricultural world is much more efficient, and let's face it, we need to grow food through satellites. Medical experiments in space, helping humanity, helping sick children every day. And that's before I even mention Teflon frying pans and those metallic things that they put around people at the end of marathons.
Yeah, those reflective.
Yeah, I think
shields.
they came out. They might not. There's a big list of fun stuff that you can. Laptop computers actually is one of them. And most of us like those, except if you're next to someone in a cafe and they're holding their morning meeting with the loudspeaker on. Get an office.
Yeah, I mean, do you think so that there could be we could be about to enter another era of technological advancement driven by the needs of developing things in space?
Yeah, well, I don't think it won't necessarily be driven by that because it's going to happen anyway. If for some reason we can't get out to space ever again, AI and quantum will, as you know better than I do, will drive inventions more than regardless. But the aspects of space, yes. I mean, another one, water purification systems. Were massively enhanced by the space race in order to purify water for drinking. Firefighters' breathing equipment massively enhanced by the tech required in the moon race. And although I don't know what they are going to be, there will be similar massive steps forward because of the things we're going to need. I just don't know what they are, but I know that they will happen because they always do. And some of them will be almost by accident. They'll come across things. Was it penicillin that was an accident? I think some guy.
So many inventions, yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, again, you're more. I'm not very good at science, but yeah, from memory, that was an accident. They were doing something else and thought, hang on a minute. So all that stuff will come out of it. It'll be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and you talked about it in the book in terms of the progression from the spacesuits that were used, by the astronauts that walked on the moon previously versus what they'll be using now in terms of the Artemis spacesuits. I forget the catchy name they gave them. But,
yeah, me too. That's the thing about writing a book. You write it, and some of the chapters that you write, a year later it comes out in print, and then 6 months later you're talking about it. So it's a year and a half since you wrote it. I really ought to read it someday.
Well, I mean, we're just sort of, I think we're coming towards the end of the discussion, but I wanted to maybe bring it back down to earth and talk a little bit about geopolitics, because I know that is what your sort of day-to-day, week-to-week focus is, and you're writing regularly on that. What are the sort of topics that are really capturing your attention at the moment that you're focusing on in terms of the things that are happening here on Earth?
I'm trying to keep up with AI, which is an impossible task. But no, I mean by understanding AI and its applications in international relations. It's a bit nebulous. I'm reading, I don't know if you read it, The Coming Wave at the moment by Mustafa Suleyman, which it's really good. But the first couple of chapters, I was really on it. The next few chapters, I'm struggling because I'm not clever enough to understand it. And every now and again, there's bits where I'm just, oh yeah, great. It's the coming wave, Mustafa Suleyman. So I'm trying to keep my head around that. The big stuff is what I mentioned at the beginning. This playing out of sorry to sound so portentous, but epoch-making occurrences. We all know we're post-Cold War.
Yeah.
So where are we? Well, I think we are in the multipolar world, although I read a very good essay recently that denied it completely and said there's still in the unipolar moment, that the Americans are still unchallenged, unparalleled. It's not multipolar. I disagree, but a lot of views are contested. I think we're still deep into multipolar, but I'm looking for the signals. So I'm sensing the signals.
Excellent.
Whilst trying not to go for confirmation bias, that we're going back to a bipolar world. That's one of my ideas. I think we are. I use it as shorthand, both bipolar and Cold War, because I think they're useful in to give us recognition, a broad brush recognition of where we're going, because we understand Cold War, we understand bipolar. As long as you then say it will be very different, but it will be versions of that, and it will be a Chinese-led bloc, an American-led bloc, people trying to be non-aligned, and only India will probably be big enough to pull that trick off. And therefore, what flows from that is pressure to be in the bloc and be on side, be a team player. And so during this 20-year period where the Americans' attention has been elsewhere, you've got examples such as Turkey, our NATO ally, buying its missile defense system from the Russians, the S-400. And the S-400 is capable of bringing down the current generation of American fighter jets. And the Turks were going to use it and also have access to these American fighter jets. And that doesn't match what an ally should be doing.
Yeah.
Because you never know that the expertise of the S-400 and then the fighter jets meshing together in Turkey might bleed out back to Moscow, giving it a better understanding of how to use the S-400 against American fighter jets.
Yeah,
that would not have happened.
Not the only person concerned about that.
Yeah, it would not have happened in the heights of the Cold War. I mean, the Americans ended up being very cross about it, but it wouldn't have happened in the Cold War. So that's an example of the swirling around of the multipolar world. But the point I'm making is that I think if we do go back towards a form, then the pressure on Turkey not to do that would be far, far greater in the discipline of a new Cold War. So there's that, there's AI, of course there's always climate change and its knock-on effects. That's the big stuff. I mean, I'm looking around at a map of the world. No, that's the big stuff. Oh yeah, and also I'm trying to keep my eye on, because this isn't really happening yet, and I thought it would happen sooner. If you study history and you look at where the coal is, you realise who can, fuel an industrial revolution. And then when you look later on where the oil and the gas is, then if you haven't got it, you go and get it, partially through colonialism, or if you're the Japanese and you need rubber for your tyres and you haven't got any, you might look at Indonesia with some interest. So now if the new oil is the rare earth materials and other metals, is that where the action is? I think it's where the action is economically. Happily, we're not seeing much conflict. We're seeing great power competition in places like Latin America and Africa, where a lot of these metals are. but happily we're not seeing much kinetic activity. So you try and track that as well. Keeps you busy.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you've throughout your career as a journalist and as a analyst of international relations and an author of books, how would you sort of reflect on the kind of current information environment? Is it getting harder or easier to stay on top of all of those subjects?
It's harder and easier. And that's an infuriating answer. Sorry, I'm infuriated with myself.
No, it's fine, yeah.
It's harder because of the plethora and also because of the amount of disinformation out there. And one of the key things we need to be teaching younger people is critical thinking and source, looking at source and its reliability and its track record. It's easier. But this actually is, I think, just through experience, in that you sensing the signal. But through experience, it's sometimes easier to look through the froth. I don't mean to be too disparaging. I'm not calling news headlines froth. It's just shorthand. But a headline is a headline, and for the love of God, breaking news. If there's an overused term in the modern world, that's it. It's not breaking news half the time. So you learn it just passes before your eyes. Yeah, got it, noted, yeah. But every now and again, you realise, actually, look, that's significant.
Yeah.
And I don't mean a major outrage or this, that, and the other. I mean what looks small. The Dutch decision that they will not give China anything when it comes to super semiconductors. That actually is a sort of small headline that isn't breaking news, barely makes any major news outlet, but that tells you what's going on. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, that's really interesting just to get an insight into sort of what you're focused on and how you're going about your work. But Tim, this has been a great discussion, and I always enjoy talking to you, and I've really enjoyed your books, as I said before. And where can we maybe direct people to go to find more of your work? Because I know you've got a site where you're posting articles regularly.
No, it's pretty much only Twitter these days. I just ran out of bandwidth for the site I used to run. Regretfully left the whatandthewhy.com. It just not enough time. So pretty much the only thing I'm on now is Twitter. iTwittius.
Or X as it's now called.
No.
Yeah.
What is this X of which you speak? No, just I'm iTwittius. Look upon my tweets, you mere mortals, and despair, something like that.
Yeah.
Which everyone always asks me, what iTwittius? Well, it's iClaudius, but for the Twitter age, all right?
That's brilliant. Great. Well, yeah, I'm sure people will look there and no doubt check out your books as well. But
again, thanks for the invitation, and I'm sorry about all the scientific errors I may well have made in the last hour.
I'm sure people will be forgiving. It's been a long time since the days of the Cold War, when space was consistently top of the news agenda, but there's been growing coverage of and interest in the activities of major and emerging world powers as they put thousands more satellites into orbit, as well as the activities of private companies that are developing new space capabilities. It was great to talk to Tim to get a sense of why and how space is being explored in this new era, and there are a few things that I learned from reading The Future of Geography and from talking to Tim on this episode. First, space has a geography. There are certain points that have more strategic significance than others. That's something we'll need to watch for as people who are interested in international relations, international affairs, intelligence and national security. These kind of developments could be key in the future. Second, the international rush to get into space is not only a rush for resources, it's about that strategic positioning. Third, the competition that is taking place could get out of hand, given the weakness of the international agreements that are still in place to govern space exploration. While that may be cause for concern, one thing's almost certain: we're going to hear a lot more about space in the coming months and years. Let's hope it's all good news. Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.